In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head. I'm Max, and Harriet, who are you?
Hi, I'm Harriet Fraud, Dr. Harriet Fraud, and I'm really glad to be here with our guest, Kevin Gallagher.
Just going to say big thank you to our patrons, First Winter, Sarah Turner, and Rebecca Johns. And of course, shout out to Liam for helping us with the editing and social media. Also, if anybody wants to send us reactions or comments, thoughts, criticisms about anything contained in the podcast today, you can email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And if you want to support us and help us kind of keep doing the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead.
And we love you even if you can't afford to contribute. We understand, but we don't love you anymore, but we sure do appreciate your patron contributions. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. You're a cool human no matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today we have a very interesting human named Kevin Gallagher, who is a former adjunct professor of psychology and sociology at Point Park University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's worked in a lot of different community health settings, including 4 years with the award-winning street medicine program Operation Safety Net. His work focuses on rethinking mental health, substance use, and addiction from a sociological and social justice perspective. And he's currently a writer for Mad in America and works in Medicaid clinical quality program development. And just a comment on Mad in America for listeners that aren't familiar, I think the website is just madinamerica.com. And we might refer to it as MIA, the Mad in America. It's a program and project that is promoting alternatives within our field, Harriet in my field and Kevin's field, psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and so on. Kind of goes against the mainstream profit-driven and hyper medicalized viewpoints that kind of prevail within our field. So that's actually how we got hooked up with Kevin, by looking at some of his articles and having an email exchange. And so we're here to talk with him today about addiction. So hi, Kevin. How's it going?
Hi, everyone. Harriet and Max, thank you again for having me on. So currently, especially in speaking about the writing I do, I am doing a series for Mad in America, an American history of drugs and addiction. And like you were saying, it's a website and blog and community and research resource that all kind of came from Robert Whitaker's book, Mad in America, which was so if you've read it, it was a critical view of the history of psychiatry and some of the less humane versions of psychology. And I'm writing the series right now because while there's always a lot of crossover between mental health and substance abuse, they're always seen somewhat as separate. And there's some historical reasons for that. So I'm in the process of, it's a 10-part series. I'm halfway through right now. And just trying to give a resource to people. It's somewhat brief, being 10 pieces, but I'm trying to get that resource to people so that, if they're on the website and you're looking at these alternative things, that they can go to this and understand, where I'm coming from, and how it fits into the larger model.
That sounds great.
Yeah, and what for those who have not yet read the series, and we'll link it in the description, but maybe with a brief, I don't know how brief you can be, but actually maybe just one step back. I mean, how and why did you get involved in this particular area of study in addiction and its history, as well as maybe how that may or may not intersect into community mental health and street medicine?
Yeah. So my history is a non-traditional one, we'll say. So I do consider myself a recovered addict, and I say recovered, not in recovery. I've found that recovery through non-traditional means, specifically harm reduction. I think we can get to harm reduction a little bit later. But just trying to dive into my story a little bit. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the critiques and controversy around Dr. Carl Hart, and the book that he's written and some of the interviews that he's done, where he came out and as he called it, a regular heroin user, but not somebody who was addicted to heroin, which is antithetical to what everybody believes is possible. But in that vein, and kind of as a way to support what he's doing, because I was on the Twitters, as one will do, and he posted out there actually for the importance of people to tell their story. So I had a really strange experience back in 2000, and it led me into the past 20 years where I've studied, worked in, taught about, wrote about, and experienced addiction, substance use, and the treatment of addiction. It was really so back in 2000, I was in college. I didn't have much direction, we'll say. I did one of those things where you graduate high school, you're supposed to go to college, so you go. And I wasn't really, we'll say, was successful the first time through. And during the spring semester of 2000, I was hanging around with a few people, a few of which would actually blend what were known as benzodiazepines, a word I had no idea of at the time, and Ritalin, and they would snort it. And I joined in. Not really much of a peer pressure situation, much more of a peer opportunity. And quite honestly, at the point I could have taken it or leave it. I couldn't even really tell what was happening, if anything, because we were drinking as well. And so we did this basically for the entirety of that spring of 2000, just about every day, if not every other day. And we got to the end of semester, and I said, maybe it's time for me to get back into classes, get myself a little bit, in order. I was actually coming up on my 21st birthday that summer. And so this group of people, they were all going to head home for the summer, and I was going to stay back and take some classes. And so at the end of that semester, I used for the last time. And about 36 hours after that, I was driving in the back of a car with a couple friends of mine. We were actually going to the Monroeville Mall, which some listeners might know as being famous for the place where George Romero filmed Day of the Dead. And on the way, I started to get these sensations down my arm. My chest started pounding. I started getting sweaty. I started feeling nauseous. And, I had to have him pull over, and I had to walk around and take some deep breaths and try and calm down. And at the time, I thought I was having a panic attack. But the symptoms never really went away. And what happened is, over that summer, unbeknownst to myself, because I had, easily managed to stop using the drug, I had put myself in a situation where I was suffering through physiological withdrawal of the drug while exacerbating that physiological withdrawal with, drinking. I was thinking to myself, I'm going to quit that stuff. I'll just be drinking. I'll be fine. I was young. I'm not saying that it's, a good choice. But that's what happened. And, everything continued to kind of spiral out. By August of that summer, I ended up in the hospital. I got bad enough. And this is actually a kind of interesting story. And it really goes to a lot of the presumptions that exist in our society. Because when I arrived there the night before, and one of the reasons that kind of spiked my symptoms, somebody had offered me a line of cocaine. And at the point, I was saying, fine, I will try anything. I don't care. And so I started it. It did not help. It actually made everything worse, which is what led me into the hospital. And I got there. My heart rate was probably about 120 beats per minute. My blood pressure was through the roof. My heart's pounding. Can't sit still. I'm sick to my stomach. I'm dizzy. I keep telling the nurse, I feel like I'm going to have a heart attack. They take me back to the ER. They hand me 2 Xanax. I take the 2 Xanax. And within 20 minutes, I'm right as rain for the first time since May.
Wow.
Yeah. And the thing about it is that I still hadn't put 2 and 2 together. I had not yet figured this out, what had happened, because of course I'm thinking to myself, well, that was back in May. It's been 4 months. This is impossible. But I had told them during the screening that I had snorted that line of cocaine. So when the doctor came in, he handed me a prescription for Xanax to help with cocaine withdrawal. And he offered me a referral to treatment for cocaine addiction.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was, it's one of those situations where as soon as somebody hears, oh, you've done this drug, okay, well, obviously, A, you're lying about it, about how much you're using, and B, you must be addicted, so you have to be. You need treatment, right?
So here's legal heroin to solve your cocaine.
Yeah.
Well, we'll say alcohol in a powder form.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so basically what happened from there is I had a script and I'd be okay. And then I'd run out, and then, I'd get the symptoms would come back, and I would start drinking to try and cover up the symptoms. And then I would get a script, and then that would run out, and I would, drink to cover up the symptoms. And it got so bad. Basically, by the end of it, I said to myself, I must be an alcoholic.
Oh.
It was the only thing I could think of that would cause this. So I ended up calling up my sister. I explained to her what was going on. I broke down. I went home. I talked to my family. I'm shaking. I'm a mess. Somebody says, okay, well, here's some, guess what? Xanax. And let's help you calm down. I'm like, oh, thank you very much. I take it. And all of a sudden I'm right as rain again. I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I just got to make sure that I don't drink. Let me take this medication, because obviously I have this, and this kind of goes back to that biochemical model of mental illness. I have the disease of anxiety, not addiction, but anxiety, because of what I was experiencing with the benzodiazepines. The problem was that as soon as that blister pack that they gave me ran out, I started going right back into that physiological withdrawal that had never subsided over that 6 months, because I never allowed my brain the time to let the GABA start balancing, the serotonin start balancing, all of that kind of stuff. And I remember this was about 12 hours. So it was 2:30 in the morning. I remember I was watching Boys Don't Cry. I still don't remember the movie because I don't think I've seen it since. And I had a seizure.
Wow.
Yeah. I woke up. It was probably the scariest thing that I'd ever been through in my life. I had no idea what happened. Why did this happen? What was going on? I went to the hospital. They're checking me out, making sure I'm not epileptic. And I'm telling everybody, of course, I think I'm an alcoholic. I think I'm an alcoholic. I think I'm an alcoholic. So they say, okay, well, let's get you into treatment, right? Makes sense. You're telling me you're an alcoholic. Obviously, you're not going to try and hide anything. Let's get you in. So I go in, and now I had the similar experience that everybody does for the first time they see the 12 steps. So I don't know, have both of you ever seen and read through the 12 steps?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm intimately familiar.
Okay. So, this kind of threw me back for a minute, because I thought of myself kind of as an agnostic and, almost atheistic person. And I started seeing God and higher power. And I started thinking to myself, okay, wait a minute, what's going on here? And I panicked for a second, but I was so scared of what happened to me. I was like, whatever, just teach me whatever. Because when I went in, I had 2 goals. Tell me why I had a seizure, and tell me how never to have it happen again.
Right.
That was it. Right. So while I'm there, what am I being taught? Well, there's the traditional idea of addiction. It's very similar in some ways to, those biochemical, chemical imbalance type ideas about mental illness. And it goes that addiction is a chronic progressive disease of the brain, marked by uncontrollable use of a substance. And without treatment, the person suffering from addiction will eventually die. That's the traditional model. And a lot of times when we teach that model, and this is part of what I'm writing about for Mad in America, is, somebody comes along and they're teaching about this disease, and they'll say, and we now know that it's this disease, and this is what happens, and this is what it is. And the truth is that this idea has been around for about 250 years. It goes back to Benjamin Rush. But I didn't know any of this stuff, and I'm taking in what they're teaching me, and I'm saying, okay, And at the time, I still thought I was an alcoholic. But when you go into treatment, you'll have pharmacists or pharmacologists come through and they'll teach you about the drugs that you're using. And I started to learn about benzodiazepines. I started to find out that, in fact, benzodiazepines, if you abruptly quit them, can send you into anxiety, shaking, nausea, sweating, raise your heart rate, all this kind of stuff, cause seizures. And it clicked. I said, oh, I know what happened. And so I went to a counselor and I said, hey, I don't think I'm an alcoholic. I think I might be an addict. And I told him the story. I told him what happened. I spilled my guts out. And I was thinking to myself, wow, I'm having this big breakthrough. Like I was still trying to accept the ideas. I just wanted to shift it from alcohol to these drugs. And he looked at me and he said, Kevin, you don't understand. You're still an alcoholic. And that kind of threw me because I'm thinking to myself, well, if alcohol didn't cause the symptoms, how could that be what drove me here? And then he looks at me and he says, have you ever tried heroin? I said, no. He said, you're addicted to heroin too. See, this is back when there was this idea. I don't know if either of you ever heard of cross addiction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an old theory. It's phased out now, but it was this idea that if you're ever addicted to one substance, you're addicted to all of them. But if you think about it for a minute, it doesn't make a lot of sense. If I'm looking for a drug that's going to calm me down, how could I be addicted to an upper like cocaine or methamphetamine? So he tells me this. It shakes me up a little bit. I'm starting to get a little bit confused, but I keep going through. I go from inpatient to partial to IOP. I start getting out into the real world and I start thinking, and I can't shake these thoughts of well, if it was these benzodiazepines that cause these symptoms, how is it that I'm an alcoholic? I never tried quitting alcohol. And alcohol, when I would drink to try and cure these symptoms, it would never completely fill. Like imagine you've got a neurotransmitter. It's kind of filling it, but some gaps are left, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I would take the Xanax or an Ativan, it would be fine, right? Now, once I'm thinking through this out in the kind of the real world, I'm looking around, I'm thinking to myself, I don't know. I don't know how does this really make sense? I started going to meetings. I was having weird experience. It was almost kind of this feeling of there's something not right here. I'm missing something. And so I started trying to do some research myself. And I started reading people like Stanton Peele, Jeffrey Shaler, Thomas Schatz, Herbert Fingarette, Maya Zalvitz, Ann Fletcher. A lot of these theorists who have been studying, I read some of the Lee Robbins Vietnam study where they figured out that 90% of GIs who were coming back from Vietnam were actually able to naturally remit from opioid addiction. I was reading stuff about controlled drinking studies by the Sobels, and I had all this information, but it basically caused this conscious cognitive dissonance within me. It was almost like, I know this isn't right, but it could be right. And if it could be right, then I could have a seizure if I drink. But if I drink, then I shouldn't have a seizure because it was this. And it kind of spun me out, if you would. And it kind of led me into the situation where this confusion drove me. Eventually, I tried drinking again. Then as soon as I drank, I was like, am I going to have a seizure? But then I would get nervous and shaky. And I'm like, oh, is this shaky because I'm having withdrawal? I had 4 beers. I don't know. And I even remember after I left treatment, I started having these nightmares. I'd be sitting there holding a Pepsi, talking to somebody. And I'd look back down and all of a sudden it was a beer. And I'd panic. And I'd have to run around and I'd have to find something else. I'd have to find booze because if not, I was going to have a seizure. I'm going to have a seizure. And so it kind of just spiraled out. And I don't want to, it would take a while to go into the next 12 years, but let's kind of just say that it kind of started feeding itself where I knew this wasn't right, but I couldn't still answer those first 2 questions. Can somebody confirm why I had a seizure and what exactly I need to do not to have it again? And there was a points in there where I would do weird things like drink. I would get 1/8 of a shot of vodka and I would drink it just to say, well, I can't have a seizure for 8 hours because I've had some alcohol in me. It was really weird experience, but it turned into this eventual, I'll call it a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by the end of the 12 years, I had been through detox 8 times. I had done another inpatient. I actually had another withdrawal seizure. I ended up, near a full-blown substance abuse disorder. And I was living at home in 2012, and I'm working 2 jobs, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, if this is still going on, because I was using about 6 to 8 milligrams of Ativan every day. I would drink at night. If I didn't drink, I'd have about 12 milligrams of Ativan, which is a huge amount. I mean, clinical diagnosis, maybe 1 or 2 in a day. And I said, okay, something must be wrong. So in July of 2012, I put myself back into a detox. I remember thinking to myself, just how much I had tried over that past year, like trying to work and trying to get myself together. And I was like, I've got to just figure something out. So when I went into detox, I came out and I said, fine, I will try and go back into AA and NA, try and 12-step again. I went out, I got myself a home group. I was talking to people about being a sponsor. And I had this strange experience where I saw, it was an old timer, and he was mocking somebody who had left the group. And I kind of had this kind of like glass shattering moment in my head of like, what am I doing here? I know better, or type of thinking. And I went out and I tried Smart Recovery. And Smart Recovery is an abstinence only program, based a lot on CBT and REBT. And
can you, just for listeners that don't know the acronyms, could you spell them out?
It's self-management and recovery training. And it's really good for, some people who want to be a little bit more analytical. I think maybe for me, and I just heard your last podcast on the PMC, the professional managerial class. It's a little bit PMC. It's a little bit kind of, we're going to sit here and we're going to, solution your problem to your drinking. And we're going to go through this ABC together and kind of come out with, it didn't really work. And I ended up, I was drinking again because there was a part of me that felt like I had just turned 21 when all this occurred. I never had a chance to try and go out and do it myself. It was like I was living in an experiment where I was the control group, but I had already been messed with in a way. And so I started drinking again. And I said to myself, look, Kevin, if you don't try and do something about this, you're going to end up using benzodiazepines again, because you're going to get freaked out. You're going to go down the path and you're going to end up having to go through detox again. So I actually looked up, I Googled, because I started hearing this term harm reduction. I Googled this group. It's called, so I Googled harm reduction for alcohol. And this group called HAMS came up. Harm reduction, abstinence, and moderation support for alcohol. And I went on there, and it was an online group. It's Kenneth Anderson's group. He started, so I'll give him a shout out. And, I went out there and I told the story just like I kind of did here. And I said, I still haven't I just want somebody to validate. Am I right? Am I thinking about this correctly? Is this okay? And they started, yeah, that makes sense. Yes. You use the benzos, you sent yourself into this. Yes, that makes sense. No, if you drink 2 or 3 beers, you're not going to have a seizure the next day. I can show you research. And I walked through that and I said, okay, well, I want to try and slow my drinking down, start to moderate it. And they said, that's great. Let's try that. Keep that plan going. And it was kind of the first time I got validation for what I wanted to do at the time. And lo and behold, it started to work. I got, 1 day alcohol free. Then I got a weekend. Then we went on a trip with my family over to England. I'm actually first generation. My parents are from England. So we were over there visiting our relatives. And I got like 8 out of 10 days. And I came back and I thought to myself, it was kind of mind blowing and crushing at the same time, because I kind of felt to myself like, yeah, it's possible. You can do this. But then you also started thinking to myself, but then I've lost 12 years. So I left. So I kind of had to work through that for a little bit. And I developed this plan. And I said, okay, well, I want to get involved in harm reduction. I want to have other people get this available to them. So I started volunteering at a needle exchange here in Pittsburgh, Prevention Point, Pittsburgh. And I started looking to go back to school to get a master's and go back to grad school. And I started looking at the program at Point Park University, and it's a very humanistic, existential, phenomenological place. And really what that said to me was that I was going to have the opportunity to study this in a way that I wanted. I was going to feel comfortable. Whereas if I'd gone to some other programs, I might have run into a situation where I'm butting heads with a professor or an advisor. Do you know what I mean? And so I signed up for there. And as I'm volunteering and taking these sample classes, I started hearing about Operation Safety Net, and they do street outreach and street medicine, and they have homeless supportive services, and they espouse a harm reduction model. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if I got a job there? And I saw that they had a position open. I applied, and I actually started grad school August. Let me see if this math works. Yeah, it was August 25th of 2013. I started at Operation Safety Net September 2nd, 2013.
Wow.
So like a week later, and everything just kind of merged from there. I continued, since 2012, the drinking continued to decline. Right now, I honestly, I can't tell you the last time I actually had a beer or any kind of drink, to be honest. I stayed clean of that whole cycle of benzodiazepines and everything like that. And then, I was working with Safety Net. I helped to run a drop-in center, a severe weather shelter. I ended up case managing at and then supervising a permanent supportive housing project. I was doing that while I was full-time grad school. And, when I was doing that, I was also doing some presentations and everything for the Society of Humanistic Psychology, Division 32 of the APA. And so I was involved in a lot. I was getting involved. I was getting moving, and everything was going. So that's kind of the story that I have, where it's a little strange, but that's my story. But it's non-traditional. I had a really weird experience that kind of led me down to this path to thinking in these new ways and kind of going into these non-traditional models.
Well, after you've gone that path and you've come to a place that feels okay, can you say, this is where I went wrong, this is what I believe now, in a kind of synthesis for our audience?
Sure. So what I learned from everything that I've read, and this is where I'm writing to in the Mad in America piece, is that, as we've taught this kind of I went through the chronic disease model. We've learned since then that, the chronicity, the progressiveness isn't true. The idea of losing control isn't true. And to kind of paraphrase Stanton Peele, it's much more about attachment. It's an attachment to, and this moves away from drugs, it's attachment to any intense experience that fulfills a need that you have, but it comes at expense of long-term health, which could be physical, social, emotional, psychological, whatever it might be. And it's much more about that experiential, psychological aspect than it is about the physiological side. That's why we can start understanding things like gambling addiction or sex addiction or, money, wealth, and power addiction. And understand this is really, and if somebody just pinned me up against the wall and said, give me a one-word answer for what addiction is, and I'm not trying to be smart or funny, it's human. Mm-hmm. It is a human ability. It is born out of our ability to attach ourselves to things. It is born out of our need to attach ourselves to things. And so, when we experience instability, insecurity, and trauma, we need to find ways to fill those holes. We need to find ways to fill those gaps, and those intense experiences do that. And so we can become attached to them, even at the expense of whatever it might be.
Well, that makes really good sense to me, and it kind of fits with the theory that started being developed by Martin R. Smith, who worked with adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families, which kind of covers almost everybody. And what he talked about, and what I then developed with him, is that since we know that every experience that you have in life has a biochemical component. And so that you then develop certain needs for things that have biochemical bases, and you look for a drug that fills those needs. And you have the opportunity, because there's a bunch of drugs out there, to try drugs and see what works for you. But there are other ways of meeting those needs. And one of the things that's really powerful about what you said, and it very much relates to what Johann Hari talks about, is connection fills a lot of human needs for experience, for validation, and for a sense that your life means something, which we don't get much in our culture, which has been starting to change, but which has been depoliticized and isolating in its capitalistic set of individual values. And that what you found was to restructure your biochemistry and therefore your brain, which is such a flexible organ, through connection. And I think in that way, it is such an endorsement of a basic socialistic, economically cooperative, in co-ops way of running an economy and a society that is an antidote to addiction. And it helps explain that as societies get more and more unequal, as America now has the dubious honor of being the most inegalitarian of all the developed countries, then people's lives, they work and work, nothing works, their lives lose meaning. And they need connection in order to restructure their lives, connection with other people in a meaningful way, so that your trajectory is very much that trajectory, and it has a biochemical explanation as well as a psychological one. It's thrilling.
Thank you. And I also like to think sometimes the biochemical, the embodiment of it all, they're happening in conjunction, right? I'm experiencing the physiological, and then the physiological is being changed by my experiences, and vice versa. We've seen that in epigenetics, and so. But yeah, I'm the Johann Hari's the famous 12 TED talk. I'm sorry, that he did about connection is really good. But if just for a second, if we do want to go into that critical path, and I think we do, about our culture and our society, especially that capitalistic nature, a lot of people today are focusing on trauma-informed care, and that's perfect, great, and good. However, we also need to worry about things like stability and insecurity. And our society, our economy is built to create instability and insecurity, build the thing that will fill it, and then sell it to you.
Yes.
Right. And I'm one thing that I've been thinking about just as I've been processing in the past couple of years is when I think about these 660 billionaires that we have. We look at those from a social perspective as this is like a positive thing, right? And then we look at the person who's suffering from heroin addiction, and they're going through a disease and they're going through a problem, and they are. How much of that is this, static specific disease? Well, that's debatable. But this person over here who's gained enough wealth that they can influence our everyday lives. You don't do that just because you got really successful. I look at the billionaires, and I look and I honestly see addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a film by Costa Gavras called Capital that's brilliant. And I only play it very briefly for obvious political reasons, but it shows the path of someone addicted to making more money. And he's very successful and uses the people around him in order to gain more. And when the various people that he's alienated, his best friend, his wife, say to him, look, you are losing all of us if you continue this. He says, I don't care. I'm winning. I'm winning. Because if the idea that you get more for yourself, you're winning, even if you lose every tie to your humanity and to other people, is the sickness of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And we do reward those people. We have programs about the rich and famous, not about the poor and miserable and unknown, which we should have, because they're Siamese twins. And so
I want
I
to.
think that's a good point.
I want to ask you, Kevin, based on your comment on the trauma, focus on trauma that's kind of emerging, trauma-informed care, and I have a critical rant on trauma-informed care. Don't want to go. It'll kind of derail, I think, a little bit. But I want to understand more what you mean, because here's, I guess, my conceptualization of this. The pros and cons of this are that on the one hand, it probably makes more sense for us now to be understanding addiction as related to personal trauma than a disease or a chemical imbalance, right? It's probably an improvement. But I guess to see if I'm understanding what you're saying is that is the flawed logic here that it's still just individualized.
Yes.
If we just say like, oh well, it's your individual trauma, so let's just throw you into the mental health industry so we can treat your trauma, and then we can sort of erase all the circumstances. Is that sort of what you're saying with the trauma model? Yeah. Okay.
Very much so, because if you think about it, there's, when I went to grad school, it's the program's actually in clinical community psychology. And there's a story that community psychologists like to tell. And it's an old fable. It's an old proverb. You probably heard it as soon as I tell it. But you're down by a riverbank and you see somebody drowning. Mm-hmm. And you go in and you pull them out and you make sure that they're okay. And then you look back and there's another person and another person, another person, another person. What is happening? Well, if you actually look down the river, you could see that the bridge is broken and people keep falling in. So with this trauma-informed care, it's trying to soften the edges of that kind of industrial model of bring them in, fix them up, send them along their way.
Yeah.
And I experienced this. And one of the things I didn't get into when I was telling my story is, I actually left the homeless services Operation Safety Net. That's actually tucked underneath a larger entity, a community health agency. And I moved from there over to managing the substance use disorder team, actually. Mm. And I thought, well, this is going to be an opportunity. Maybe I can, find some spots and some little holes I can, put some new stuff into, but it's dang near impossible because you've got regulations on the books that say if you're a licensed drug and alcohol provider, you have to do X number of things. You have to teach this theory. You have to teach them this thing and this thing and this thing. You have to do this thing for their aftercare. And it just taking that idea that like the whole theory model of it didn't fit with me. And then, looking from that management perspective of it, like, there was some clinical supervision and talking about the actual people we were serving, absolutely. But there was also a lot of, well, we've got this wait list. How many people can we get off the wait list? Who's got spots open? Like who can we move on? Who can we move on? Who do we need to move up to a higher level, right? And there's that model of bring them in, especially from community mental health, which is where most people who are suffering the most go. Mm-hmm. It's bring them in, fix them up, send them along. It's levels of care. It's that Ford industrial model. And so you take the trauma-informed care and you just kind of lay that into it. It's not changing the whole thing. Whereas if you say, where does all the trauma come from? Mm-hmm. Why are we having all this trauma? Why, as a society, do we have all these rates of addiction? Why do we have these rates of addiction in certain pockets? Mm-hmm. How are these things happening? To understand it at that social level. And I think a lot of the way that I've kind of gone, especially after that experience managing that team, is to start moving away from kind of that individualized, how do I work with that person, to how do we fix the system?
Okay. I have maybe this is too big of a question, but are you familiar with the Liberation Health model, by the way? We had Don Belkin Martinez on a few months ago who kind of got into that.
They have a book out.
Yeah, well, Well, anyway, you could check it out later. It doesn't seem like it's a hugely like popular or used model. It was new to the two of us, but the emphasis that it had in sort of putting someone at the center. I'll just kind of describe it briefly and then kind of ask this sort of troubling question I have. Put the person in the middle of this triangle, and at each of the 3 points in the triangle, there's one. So, and then there's the problem. The individual's problem is in the center of the triangle, and then you map out of the 3 points. One, what are the individual causes, or maybe ways that the problem is there for you? What are the cultural elements in the culture, and what are the institutional elements? And you kind of map the whole thing out to like conceptualize the person's problem in this really broad sense that's like way outside of the individual, because you include individual things, but you also include everything else. I guess one frustration for me, having, I'm relatively fresh out of 5 years in community mental health, is that even if we conceptualize problems more broadly than the individual, do we even have the capacity within the model of community mental health as individual clinicians to like effectively do systems change work? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely.
Like, how do we actually do that?
Yeah, I didn't know of the liberation health model, but that's very interesting, and I am going to check that out. I know about liberation pedagogy, and I always Paulo Freire.
Yeah, I think they're definitely informed by that kind of thinking. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's a major question. My girlfriend is actually she's a licensed counselor and trained art therapist, and so she works in a health center setting herself, and has some frustrations about that fact that as much as they can do for that person when they're with them, there's so many other things that are untouchable, right? There's I mean, it's one of the experiences is okay. Well, while you're working in that community health setting, let's start introduction case management. But is a case manager going to give a person the keys to a home, or are they going to refer them to another program that's going to refer them to another program that might get funding if we can get this money from the state, but the state doesn't want to do it anymore because blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And those things always become so untouchable to even fill the needs left by those social issues, let alone change the social issues themselves through that model.
Yeah, well, one of the troubles is that those are socio-political questions. Yeah. And what you hope that people can do is connect with themselves and each other and see that the program is, that there's a system against them. There is a system of interlocking capitalist parts, breeding precarity and pain at the bottom and enriching the top. And that joining together with other people is their only hope to change the wider system, while they also try to be self-aware and support each other. Because I think that although the 12-step model has some limitations, it also works when it does because it's a communist model. Each according to his or her or their abilities, to each according to his or her needs, with no money involved, and a community of acceptance and support, which is very healing.
Let me just jump in there because that's absolutely how I've seen it. And it's when people say, how do the 12-step work? The last thing I usually would bring up is the 12 steps themselves.
Yeah.
And I would actually go to the fact that it builds community, it builds meaningful community and connections to people that have had similar experiences, while also giving you, personal, meaningful responsibilities.
Right.
It's why before you even get on your first step, you're supposed to pick up, and find a home group and a sponsor.
Right.
You get the community and the responsibility, and like even if it's just making the coffee type of thing before a meeting, it's those things that really work for people. Whereas, sometimes the 12 steps can, they can, depending upon how the person interprets them or works with them or not, that can sometimes be the hiccup. Whereas those two things are the most important part of it.
I think there's an element of it being peer-led as well, instead of a sort of the hierarchy of like a professional. Because like with the other issue with community mental health that I think is another big elephant in the room. And without some major overhaul of funding or restructuring, I don't really know what to do about this. But people often are feeling like they're just getting kind of like almost, when you're trying to like call the to like pay your bill, and you're like, hey, there was an error on the form. They're like, let me transfer you to this person, and then they transfer you to the department, and then the call follows through, and you have to go over again. I feel like people feel like that in the community mental health world. We're like, here's this counselor. No, you know what? They actually just they just left for another place, so you're getting transferred to another clinician. And then after like 6 months, you might see 3 or 4 different people, and you haven't really built a sufficient connection with people. They might be like kind of undertrained, or they might be like burnt out or whatever. So you're actually just feeling like there's all these like, I think you can actually build a sense of hopelessness and just saying like, well, I've been told that this system is the best way for me to get help. None of these people really seem to know what the hell they're doing, and they don't even stick around for very long, right? So in some cases, you go to this 12-step group, and there's all these like disheveled people, like just kind of being just being like weird and crazy and like quirky, like human beings, like you're saying. There's just these existential entities that are similar to you, that you're like, oh, these are just regular folks. And I think for my participation in past 12-step, which I don't think I've really mentioned in this program, but that was something that I actually felt it was like super bewildering. I was like, these people are psychos. But I was also like, well, they're psychos like me, and I need this help, right? So I know it's not for everyone at every point in their life, but I think the community mental health, as beautiful as community mental health can be, that the drawback can be that people just see like, wow, this is really broken and this doesn't work for me. So
also, 12 steps really do need, and of course they won't get all these free churches if they had it, but they need a step of looking for the social conditions that shaped their problem, even if they are looking at the family as an institution, and why is that so promoted while any support for it is denied? Why do they think anyone who gets knocked up can take care of a vulnerable person 24 hours a day? What's going on here? Changing the social support for the future, shifting it back onto the individual shoulders of people who can't manage it. Let's look at the social conditions of what's going on here and how we could change them. And I know in the 12-step world, that's considered a cop-out on personal responsibility. And what we're talking about, the 3 of us, is not just personal, like the program says. It's also that there are a lot of forces getting you to this uncomfortable place around which you need a lot of forces to get help. And so that with every step, whether it's a moral inventory, which is important personally, but it's also important to look at your country. Look at the moral inventory of this country, built on genocide and racism and exploitation. Maybe that was a problem, and maybe we could change that. That there has to be a social component, even though I think one of the reasons that every little tiny town has at least an AA is because they've exacted that component from the analysis.
And I want to agree absolutely. And I think that's part of where I really wanted to, when I was studying it and now I'm writing about it, is diving into the history of it. And we kind of think of AA and 12-step as this kind of singular entity, but it's got a history where it goes through the Oxford group before it, the Washingtonians, the temperance movement. And that all kind of reaches back to when we originally created this idea about addiction being, this personalized, individualized, internalized, reductive thing. And basically, it all started with Benjamin Rush, and I hate this term, but the father, quote unquote, misogynistic a little bit there, of American psychiatry, looking around and seeing poverty. And instead of saying like, well, what gave rise to this poverty? How did the systems do it? He basically, to paraphrase the questions, is how did these poor people cause this poverty?
What was wrong with them that they're poor?
Exactly.
And he would, there used to be a saying, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Right. It's the same idea.
Yeah. And so then he looked and he saw, oh, well, they're drinking. Okay, well, we're getting around the time of like germ theory and like infectious disease. So say, well, the alcohol's going in, it's infecting the body and it's causing these changes. And if you really think about this idea, it's almost like a zombie effect. that's described by this kind of traditional model where like the drug takes over the body,
right?
like, almost like
the mind.
Yeah, and we've kind of always known it's not really that, and so I think that history of coming from that point of, if the question originally was how did these poor people cause poverty, and that's really instructed the history leading up to kind of what the content is, and I think that part is missing, is how did the poverty get there. Maybe that's actually a good segue for Dr. Hart, because so just the background of Dr. Hart, and he's probably one of those other researchers that I've well looked up to in my career in academic history. He came from a poor area in Miami. He joined the Air Force to get out of the community. Ended up getting stationed over in England, and it was over there that he started having different experiences with people and their expectations of him based upon his race. And this kind of opened up some opportunities. That's how he got into studying psychology. And part of what he wanted to study was addiction, because there was that idea, especially around Miami at that time, it was around the 80s, that, crack cocaine was there and it was causing the poverty. So if we can figure out how to cure people of their crack addiction, we can cure poverty. So he went and he got his PhD. He started studying it. He started replicating some old studies. Some of them would be like, if I would take a $20 bill and $20 worth of crack cocaine, and I offered it to somebody who's a regular, somebody that I could, through a screener, I could diagnose as having, a severe, not opioid, but substance use disorder for cocaine. And I offer them these two choices. Which one would they pick? If they're of equal value, the theory would be, well, they would just take the crack, but majority of people would take the $20. And he would start seeing this happen, and he started studying it more and more. He started diving into the history. And so when he came out with his book, High Price, before this last one, he talked about a little bit of his history and how he studied this and how he came to these ideas of, everybody's always taught this idea that, drugs are coming in, they're infecting, and they're causing the poverty. But in reality, as he's seen it, the poverty causes the drug use.
Yeah.
The conditions are causing somebody, once again, kind of going back to that attachment searching idea. People are in those situations and they're looking for something to get them out of it, something to take away the pain for a moment, whatever it might be.
Well, I think it also kind of, so when I think of, I can imagine, like, what's that movie, Wolf of Wall Street, with Leonardo DiCaprio, where like I could think of like billionaires in Wall Street, like using coke and using whatever they might like use, we have that framework of there's like use, abuse, addiction, there's a sort of spectrum. But I when I think of like those guys, I mean, there's probably and definitely like addiction present there. I think like that, even that movie showed, right. And I think that there's more behavioral addiction problems, right? Like like the workaholism, the addiction to sort of status and success is like primary, and like the substance stuff is just like they're like messing around. They're just sort of like flaunting the status by using all the expensive drugs or whatever. But to me, there's this isn't devil's advocacy, but it's sort of like the flip side of that, where it's like the poverty leading to, like when you don't have enough, you need to try to fill up the not having enough with something. But then I think there's this interesting flip side where when you have like a way excess that's also based on the exploitation of others, I think there's this almost like you have this almost spiritual deficit or something actually emerges from that, where you have to fill that with something. And that's where I think, so I think that conceptualization works from both sides. I think it's like more materially tangible when we're talking about poverty, but then it also just speaks to, I think, the, and I'm not even making like religious statements or something about this. I guess maybe from a moral perspective, I think when you think of like the Wolf of Wall Street people, or Jeff Bezos, or whoever, even like the good billionaires, like the Bill Gateses. Like,
I was just going to say Bill Gates.
Right.
Yeah, Bill Gates is probably, who knows how much coke he does, but like, but like, definitely that's not gonna, we're not gonna find news about that anytime soon. But I think it goes, there's still a devoid of something for people in that sort of echelon of society as well.
Well, if you're going to be in that echelon of society, you're going to be on top of a massive pyramid of exploitation.
Right, exactly.
You know, and one of the things that has changed that enhances addiction is that in the 1970s, CEOs got approximately 40 times more than the average worker in their industry. McDonald's now, their CEO gets 3,000 times more than the average worker in the McDonald's industry. In order to do that, you have to harden your heart. You cannot afford the human continuity and compassion that makes us sane.
Mm-hmm.
You can be like people are. You look at Bezos, he just found somebody else, he's having a lot of sex or whatever. He's reduced to his own desires and sensations, like somebody who has nothing in the world, because the detachment from other human beings that comes from despair or comes from exploitation are somewhat similar. You cannot do what Bezos does and have people getting COVID by the hundreds in your warehouses because you're packing people together at unsafe distances in order to get the product out while you actually care about them. And you're just thinking of how to go into outer space and how fun that'll be. That there is a disconnect with humanity, which can happen in despair and it can happen in affluence. But the disconnect is not only immoral, it's unhealthy mentally. Because if attachment and community and connection are what mental health is about, they're out of luck.
And also we should probably emphasize though too, because like it's not the level of disconnect, whether you're on the top or the bottom, is not equal in the sense that your level of power is not equal. And so therefore I think a billionaire who does live in excess and is abusing, quote unquote, abusing drugs or whatever, nobody cares. Like it's sort of expected and they're not going to get punished for it. Whereas if you're at the bottom, like you might have to, you're going to like lose your housing, you're going to go to prison, you're going to, you're like materially and sociologically screwed, based in part, I think, based on the perception of like, oh, that's really immoral what you're doing. But then also just because of the way our economy is set up where the safety nets aren't really strong enough and that we don't really have an effective treatment. I mean, there's treatment models and then there's even just the way we implement them and the way we conceptualize it is like so like backwards. So
I mean, for the treatment aspect, I think, I think we've got a lot of the stuff out there that could do a lot of good, but we've got to make sure that people have basic needs before they start worrying about, diving into whatever it is, but also just, trying to teach a more humane view of addiction is going to help, as opposed to, because we've learned both in addiction and mental health, when you use this disease idea, we believe that it's going to eliminate stigma, but it actually creates more stigma because it's literally stigma. It's marking somebody as the thing, this other thing here, the abnormal, right? And I mean, if we're going to go back to cocaine and affluence versus poverty, this is the crack disparity in a nutshell. We have 100 times greater sentencing for crack cocaine than powder cocaine. Right. And there's a disparity in who uses crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, and then, and kind of just as a sign of our times, we saw it as some kind of huge victory that we lowered it from 100 times to 10 times. Like, no, in my view, it shouldn't be illegal anyway, but that is not a victory. It's still accepting of this idea, and that, the person who uses a drug, and maybe that's also part of the controversy about Dr. Hart right now, whereas if a person uses a drug and it is this list of drugs that we've created, then this person has to be addicted to it because there's no other way of doing that.
And he proves that he is a highly functional, celebrated researcher with a prestigious position at Columbia, and he's enjoying his drugs when he feels like it.
Right. I mean, during this pandemic, how many times have we seen people posting about the shipments of booze that they got? And, being able to make it through because I had my bottles of whiskey. How many podcasts I've listened to that started advertising Jura whiskey, not to call them out or anything, but I'm just thinking about, just we use, and it's a terrible drug.
Yeah.
It is probably the worst drug out there. It affects every part of your brain, every part of your body. And the way I think about it too is like, imagine you're sad. Let's put sad, just write sad on like a bullseye on a target. You could take a drug like an opioid and you can hit it with a dart. You're tired and you're lethargic. You can hit it with like Adderall, bang. You can hit that with a dart. Now let's imagine you're sad and the only option you have is alcohol. It's like taking a shotgun and shooting it at the target. You have no idea what's going to happen. You could go in sad and you could end up angry. You could go in angry, you could end up crying. You could go in happy, you could end up whatever. There's no control over it. It affects all of the brain chemistry, and it's just, but yet I can go down to the gas station and pick up a bottle of it.
Yeah. And in those countries like Portugal and Uruguay and other countries where drugs are legal, they find that the drug use goes way down. They cut drug use 75% in Portugal. When they made the drugs legal, the government sold them in a contained way, and there was always a chance to get off the drug and get some help with it when you bought the drug. And then the government used the money to help people. And they cut down addiction wildly. 1 in 4 Portuguese people used to have a drug addiction. Also, they changed their government, which is a very important thing. For the last, 15 years, between 10 and 15, there were a coalition between the Communist Party, the Green Party, and the Socialist Party. So there's 3 main players, and they have a different philosophy about what's important in life and what's important to people, which also functions to save people from addiction, that there is a place and people do have a future and we all need help, and there's no shame in that. It's a very different philosophy.
And then just also thinking about that, a lot of people, and I think this is one of the other things I've seen lately, is that I think these cultural ideas about addiction and mental illness run so deep that even people on the left in this country don't have that critique, because I've seen people like I respect who write for publications, Jacobin, Current Affairs, and they're even kind of piling on, what's happened with Dr. Hart. And I've seen a lot of them have some ideas like we got to stop spending money on criminalizing and throwing people in jail, and we got to push them to treatment instead. But here's the thing: in Portugal, they didn't actually push everybody into treatment. They gave everybody housing, career training, income, whatever they needed. And then if they gave them some therapy or treatment if as needed, but it wasn't just push them into therapy either. And I think, at least for these topics, I think there needs to be, on the left, kind of a knowing critique of where all these ideas came from. And I think that would help a lot of expansion of some of these policies, some of these ideas getting out and open. And, whereas I see, as much as some on the left might want to decry neoliberalism, a lot of what we have in the treatment models and everything today is very neoliberal. And they're still not quite there with that critique yet. And hopefully your podcast and others like it will get that done.
Well, I was just listening to, there's a podcast called, I think it's This is Revolution. This is Revolution podcast. And they were actually talking about the current kind of discussion about like police abolition and basically what their critique was. They were talking about this idea that suddenly is like, let's replace cops with social workers, which like in theory seems like a really good idea. And it's related to the same sort of cry for like decriminalization and then throw treatment at it, is like get rid of cops and throw treatment at it. Is that they were talking about the very real issue of like, well, social workers are already like kind of like underpaid, overworked, burnt out, and like, you could just try just sort of reforming the system with these little teeny tiny tweaks. But I guess what my sort of the bumper sticker thing I'm trying to say here is that I think I agree with your assessment that the left generally, and like whether it's media pundits or people that just sort of write articles all day about stuff, they're not mental health professionals, but they sort of like use our profession sometimes to make political points that I don't think they've thought through very, very much. Yeah. Like, and I don't even mean that as like a diss of them. I just think that like people don't understand even what treatment, they don't understand the treatment models, the history. Like you're trying to write in your article, in your series, like here is a really complex history from sort of the inception of the US, or even maybe before and during different periods of the different ways that we've talked about, understood, and tried to treat or criminalize or whatever addiction. And that is not, I think, understood in the mainstream. And so like everything you just mentioned about Portugal, of them. So another way to put this is maybe people need to start understanding that quote unquote treatment and quote unquote mental health doesn't always involve mental health professionals and doesn't always involve mental health treatment, if that makes sense. Like housing, like guaranteed housing and decommodification of human needs is a mental health treatment, right? But those are like policies.
You can't see it, but I'm pumping my arms up in the air. Yes, that's kind of where I've ended up myself. Where it's like treatment, we have treatment, but we need to actually open up more space in treatment, if you would. We need to, like, if you start throwing social workers at everybody, it doesn't matter because those social workers aren't going to have the resources. So if somebody comes and they need housing, they're not going to be able to get you housing because it doesn't exist. But something like a guaranteed housing, some form of income, Medicare for all is not just about getting people access to treatment. In and of itself, by giving people the stability of guaranteed health care, is a preventative and curative for a lot of mental health and addiction issues. Just the more stable, the more people's basic needs are met, the better we're going to be able to do these things. And not only that, but when you do that and people are able to work through things a little bit, it's going to give a little bit of space, so that the overworked, burned out therapists and social workers might actually have some resources to work with, and, if we actually gave them, I actually at one point, I was right before I was offered a promotion when I was at, when I was in community mental health. I was actually starting to, I became a member of the IWW to try and start an organizing campaign for the therapists and social workers, because it's things like conditions of work that need to get better. Like every single therapist is out there trying to get enough to get their license so they can go into private practice because they can't live without it.
But what you have is you have a set of socialist collective values which are different. So if you look at what Jacinda Ardern recently did this year, no, it was 2020, not 2021, but what she did in order to create equal pay is she looked at the jobs that are caring for people that were traditionally undervalued, and she had a whole commission break them down into the skills that they required that are actually valued, marketplace skills, and then change the pay scale. So social workers got a 30.5% increase because their work was valued. If you have a different economic, social, cultural system, you have a different set of values and whose work has value, so that a stockholder like Jeff Bezos, who doesn't do anything now that he's not even pretending to be CEO, he just collects money every day. He wins the lottery from his, from the 10,000 working for him. That you change the values, so that is not valuable. So that you have what many countries have is they have a maximum wage, and and they can't get more than that, and so then they have a lot more money to pay for Medicare for all, because you're not, a wonderful example is the stock transfer tax in New York, where I live. That was passed in 1905, it was passed that for every $100 worth of stocks sold on the New York Stock Exchange, a nickel has to go into the treasury of the city. In 1985, it was counted, but it was stopped. It's already on the books, but they don't do it because who's going to pay for their campaign contributions? It's an interlocking system, and we need systemic change in order to heal people. And that's the trouble. And that's what people have to keep in mind while they try to get themselves together and connect as a group to change the system.
This actually brings me back to a client I have, so there's a, let's see, how do I, like sometimes try to give client stories and like be super not specific with identifying. There's a, I think I'm pretty good about it, but I guess, okay, I'll just say this. There's someone who, very hardcore identifies as like, I'm a recovering, addict person, but like very 12-steppy, and like not the way we've been describing 12-step is like, oh, it's this community support thing. I think there is actually a danger of sometimes this sort of personality development or reinforcement of people that really are like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, take personal responsibility, but then they start to like push that on other people. And I would say that this person very much pushes it on their kids, and that's actually what the whole like treatment's about. But I'm saying that because I think our emphasis here in saying like, well, we need to start thinking through how to develop better policies, systems, institutions that are more kind of like nurturing and equitable. That I think sometimes, here's another sort of danger sometimes of the 12-step model, or just the take personal responsibility model for people that do get sober, is that they often don't think, once they get clean or are in recovery, they don't think like, how do I now integrate myself into some sort of a more cohesive collective to make things better for everyone? They're like, oh, good, I did better for myself, and I'm just going to keep doing better for myself. I think that's a little unfortunate to me sometimes, because I would really love for people to come out of these programs saying like, okay, now it's time that we all work together to make the system better so that people don't end up in the situation I was.
There has to be a step at the end to consider the social conditions of your addiction and do something about it.
Yeah.
And they stay politically pure and get a lot more freebies by not addressing that at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, 13th stepping is currently referred to like trying to sleep with people.
I know that's
in the program. So I guess we should call this 14th stepping. Is like now you 14th. I don't know. You join DSA or something.
Or we could just change the 13th step. Yeah.
To get rid of that, because it's just kind of like a gross. I mean, it's funny, but it's also gross.
No, but we have to say next step. What is social conditions that shaped my addiction and shapes that of others, and what can we do about it?
But I do think, just Max, to your point, there are some tripwires built into there. When you start, if you do come out and you start saying, okay, well, look at the history, the generational trauma, and all this other kind of stuff, there is a danger of somebody with a little bit more time who's gained a little bit more, just let's straight call it power within the group, that can come up and use that whole slogan of, well, think about your side of the street. What's your part in this type of thinking? And there is built into it, and I think there in everything we kind of build as human, there's always good parts. There's always some misses, we'll say, and opportunities. And I think that is one of them, where it really does kind of reduce everything. And even if you take, and it's strange to do this because I know America is a very individualized culture, but at the same time, if you think about the program itself, it's taking the individual and saying, no, the higher power is over there, and you kind of have to hope that it's helping you, type of thing. And you're in it, but you're not, you're kind of out of it. It's something that happens without you, and you kind of got to worry about yourself, your side of that street type of mentality. And I think there is a little bit of danger in that, like you're talking about.
Well, there's also to conjure the PMC thing, even though PMC is not like the greatest, most perfect concept anyway, but like I can imagine you get some managers at a firm like using that language, and let's say they're even like recovered addicts, and they're saying to their employees who are trying to collectively bargain for better conditions, like, listen, guys, we know you got it tough, but what's your side of the street here, right? Like it's kind of that same logic. If you look at it, if there's a power imbalance, that logic doesn't, Jeff Bezos could be saying that to the thousands of workers trying to unionize Amazon right now. I'm just saying, like, look, guys, I know you want the air conditioners to actually work, and you want the PVE gear, and you want better wages and benefits, but look at what you're doing, right? Yeah. It doesn't work outside of the context of, like, I'm struggling with a severe addiction as an individual. Like, once you're out of that mode, I think we do need more critical thinking.
You do, because it's also, what's your side of the street? Well, you're on the street. It has two sides. So don't just stay on your side. Look across the street too. Not only across the street. And the idea in not including any of the social shapers of addiction is to stay politically safer on the one hand, but it also misses out on half the street. And I think that's, Americans are just waking up to the idea that we're not going to get anywhere without each other.
Yeah.
That we need each other. And AA and the other 12 step are in contradiction with the idea that it's just your responsibility. You need the group.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to go through the steps with a sponsor. You need each other. And the higher power, the component of the higher power, whatever you want to make it, but whatever you want to make it is your business. But what's made it by the organization is the higher power of doing it together, which is what the organization actually does for people.
And I think there's a blindness to that in sometimes the groups. They don't really see that happening,
Well, it's an ideological aberration in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to fight.
I guess if we were going to be like super journalisty interview questiony earlier, one of the ones that we had on the list was to ask you, Kevin, how sort of U.S. hegemony or like ideology has trickled down into the treatment models that we use. And now I'm kind of seeing, just through, instead of doing it mechanically asking you, we've sort of emerged there numerous times in our conversation. And that I'm starting to realize just now, I hadn't thought of it too much, but it actually is, although Harriet has said, I think accurately, that there's a quote unquote communistic kind of element or ethos to the 12-step model, there very much is that U.S. hegemony of like rugged individualism also that, I don't think was meant to ever be built into it. I think it was supposed to synthesize both. Like, you're going to take personal responsibility and utilize the collective to like grow out of this problem you have, but it very often is like leaned far toward the individualistic mentality, while not actually, which is just inaccurate. Because like you just said, Harriet, right? Like, there's a sponsor. The sponsor had to get trained and do the steps through somebody else. That without the group, you wouldn't even be able to have the conversation about the individual treating the problem. So, but I can kind of see now too how like the ideology has sort of trickled in even to 12-step groups, even if it was never meant to.
It's an obvious contradiction that we need the group to do individual responsibility. Well, on the one hand, we are individually responsible. On the other hand, we are part of a group that influences us all the time, and we need their support. And those contradictions are what is in that triangle in liberation therapy. That there are personal things, but there are also cultural and socioeconomic things that have to be addressed. We can't stay within the personal just because it's much more subsidized in our culture. One of the things is we are talking about how you have to decommodify the basic needs of life for a sane society, whether they're food or whether they're heat or whether they're water or whether they're temperature regulation or whether they're clean air. Those have to be decommodified.
Yeah.
And I think that in order for people not to look to an addiction to fulfill their need for experience and connection, we have to decommodify basic needs as a sort of preliminary, or at least
and we need
simultaneous push.
And I think we need that. And I think the three of us are probably on this sort of path of trying to advance a movement. We're not sort of like vanguard leaders in a movement or anything, but I think trying to advance a movement within the mental health world to actually normalize that conversation idea and move toward effective activity that can actually make that reality, right? Because I think we're all in agreement that like we can't just keep throwing quote unquote treatment at everything. It's like it doesn't work.
No, the person isn't an isolate. So we have to include other things as well.
Yeah, right.
And I guess just one last story just on that topic. I actually, Stan Peele's another one of those. Stan, P-E-L-E, if people want to look him up. He's been kind of decrying a lot of these theories for a very long time. He's wrote Love and Addiction, Diseasing of America. But I actually got an opportunity to try and work with him on kind of a pamphletizing of one of his books. And the first draft that I gave to him, he came back and he said, "This is really good, but we've got to cut out this political language."
Of course.
And in a way, I get it, because you want to broaden up. You don't want to put a barrier up between somebody and some knowledge.
You don't want to alienate people.
Right. But I think what I'm really trying to do, and I just piggybacking and kind of validating what you're saying, is what the writer I'm trying to do is trying to include that language purposely, because you can't separate the personal from the political.
Right. So that's right. That's a very good way to kind of summarize it all in our conversation today.
So Kevin, we will put the link to your series that, as you said, is a 10-part series. You're on, I think, the 5th. You're probably writing the 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Correct? From Mad in America. We'll put it in the description for listeners if they want to read your work. Do you have any other things you want to plug in terms of, projects or publications or anything that you want people to look into?
So actually, just on that note, I'm starting to build a website that's kind of a compendium of all of my writings, and trying to kind of pull together some of these other alternative ways of seeing addiction. It's called existentialaddiction.com. Very bare bones right now. I'm just trying to get everything launched. So basically a resource for the writing I've done, writing some other people have done, as well as some connections to harm reduction and other kinds of alternative groups that are out there. So yeah, that's the other piece of that work that I'm doing right now.
Good. That sounds exciting. Great. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this. Thank you again.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work, or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.